Hey there, this is Eric Keller for ZBrush Jewelry Workshop, and I put together a video here to answer a question that we frequently get from new users or people who are interested in incorporating the power of ZBrush into their jewelry or their object fabrication workflow. And that question is, what's the difference between ZBrush Core and ZBrush? So if you go over to pixelogic.com and check out the website, you'll find lots of great information. If you go to 3D software, you can see there's a link for ZBrush. They'll give you some great information on what ZBrush is and how it works, plus lots of beautiful images from wonderful artists. And then if you check out the menu, you can also see that there's a link to ZBrush Core. This will take you to a website. Again, lots of beautiful images and lists of features and so on. But it's still kind of like, okay, but what really is the difference? So I came up with this idea to sculpt the same ring, a mantis ring, praying mantis ring that I had in mind, and I sculpted it twice. I sculpted it once in ZBrush Core and once in ZBrush, and I recorded both of those sculpting sessions and then edited down into this demonstration that you're about to see. So these images are CG renders of the ring design that I created using Redshift for Maya. So the ring hasn't been produced yet. I'm still working it out. This version has a bit more detail. I've added wings and sort of a suggestion of an abdomen and that kind of stuff. But if we take a look here in ZBrush, here's the ZBrush version of the ring that I'm about to sculpt in this video. And here's the ZBrush Core version. They're slightly different because I sculpted both from scratch using slightly different techniques, but that's kind of the whole point. So the advantage that ZBrush Core has is that it's less expensive and easier to learn because it doesn't have as many tools as ZBrush. The main advantage of ZBrush is that it's more powerful, has many more tools. So I always compare it between like a 25-foot sailboat and a luxury yacht. Both of them will take you where you need to go, but the yacht's going to take you there in style, probably a little bit faster. However, if you're using ZBrush Core just to test things out, the main question is, can you actually produce something in ZBrush Core? Can you take something from an initial idea all the way to a file that you can export and then print and cast and so on? And the good news is, yes, you can. And here's the proof. Here's some photographs of a ring that I created entirely in ZBrush Core. Exported it, printed it, cast it. Here's the actual ring. You probably can't see it because it's out of focus, but it does actually exist, and I'm quite proud of it. All done in ZBrush Core. And then another bit of good news is that I have an entire tutorial on how I did this ring in ZBrush Core available on ZBrush Jewelry Workshop. If you look under free tutorials and scroll down, you can see here is the ZBrush Core Octopus Ring tutorial, and there's a couple other tutorials, including one on ZBrush Core Mini. So if you watch this video, you want to follow along, this is how I set it up. I do a bunch of things to the ring in ZBrush Core, and then I switch over to ZBrush and I work on the same part from scratch, but I show you some of the different tools that you can use in ZBrush so you can compare the two. I also have some logos at the bottom of the screen so you can keep track of which program I'm in. So ZBrush Core has the white background with the orange logo. It says ZBrush Core. ZBrush has the orange background with the black logo, and it just says ZBrush. So keep track of that. I'm also using a custom interface in ZBrush. So let me expand, show you what I mean. So normally ZBrush looks like this. This is the standard interface. I'm using a custom interface that we've designed specifically for jewelry sculpting. It's actually designed by Thomas Wittelsbach. And if I go into Preferences and restore custom UI. So this is the custom UI. So I'm using this when I'm in ZBrush. So that's another clue since I made it look very different from ZBrush Core, so you can keep track of which program I'm in. And I use different materials. Okay, so that being said, let's get into it and dive in, and we'll start in ZBrush Core. So in ZBrush Core, I'm going to load a project by going to Lightbox, going into this folder, and loading a pre-made ring object. I can use the 3D Print Hub plugin to verify the size in millimeters. Now, if I go over to ZBrush, I can do kind of the same things, but I can also have more flexibility to load custom-made tools, like this ring tool that we provide for ZBJW members that already has the ring, the mandrel, and everything set up at the right size. And we have a variety of sizes available as well. So a little bit more flexibility there, but not a huge difference overall. Back in ZBrush Core, I'm going to turn on radial symmetry, do a bit of smoothing, and I'm going to add a polymesh star as a subtool. So a subtool is kind of like a separate object that you can manipulate, so you can build up hierarchies or a simple hierarchy of various objects. I've added a cube and I've smoothed it, and I used the gizmo to move it up, and I'm going to switch over to some sculpting brushes, the move brush, turn on my symmetry on the x-axis, and just simply start shaping out the mantis head with this low polygon object. And this is all kinds of stuff that you can do, both ZBrush Core as well as ZBrush. In ZBrush, I'm going to take a slightly different approach, though, just to demonstrate one of the major differences. I'm going to add a cube as a subtool, just like I did in Core. I'm going to adjust the subdivisions using the gizmo tools. But then I'm going to switch over to the Z modeler brush. Once I get this in place, I'm going to position at the top of the ring, maybe scale it down a little bit. And I'm going to switch over to the Z modeler brush, which is only available in ZBrush. And this allows me to directly manipulate polygons. So I can select these polygons here and use Z modeler to extrude them out. Likewise, I can add divisions, like an edge loop right there, and then select these polygons, pull them out, have them kind of merge seamlessly with the polygons above. Same thing with the top here. So that's a huge difference between ZBrush and ZBrush Core. And the Z modeler brush is something that you would find extremely useful if you're going to do a lot of this type of modeling. But now I'm going to subdivide it just like I did in Core, switch over to the move brush, change my brush size, and then just kind of shape this a little bit, get more of that mantis-like head going. You can see I have more options for materials in ZBrush as well. Back in Core, let's get to some simple sculpting with the eyes. I'm going to switch over to the inflate brush. So I don't have nearly as many brushes in ZBrush Core as I do in ZBrush, but I still have enough to make some very nice details in this model. So I'm kind of just defining the areas of the eyes there, doing a bit of smoothing, and just kind of carving in some detail with the Damien standard brush. So that's where the antennae are going to go. And down here, I'm starting to kind of delineate the mouth parts, and using the smooth brush and the sculpting brushes to kind of make these plates that you see on the head of the mantis. So this part of the workflow where I've subdivided the model and I'm using the sculpting brushes to kind of work out these details and block in these areas, this is very similar between ZBrush Core and ZBrush. Both of them have very powerful sculpting brushes and the ability to subdivide models so that you have lots and lots of points to work with. The main difference, though, is that ZBrush has many more brushes and brush presets available than ZBrush Core. So that's one huge difference right here. But at the same time, as you can see, as I'm blocking these parts out, this is the ocelli. These are the three little eyes that appear on the top of the mantis head. Sort of their very primitive eyes. Sorry, a little bug nerding out there. Couldn't help myself. So now we're back in ZBrush and using the same move brush, just like I did in ZBrush Core. And then I'm using a similar brush to block out where the eyes are. You can see I have my reference photo there. That's actually not part of ZBrush. That reference photo is from a program called Pure Ref, and I highly recommend it. It's a great little app. It's a standalone app that you can load in reference images, and then you can have it above whatever application you're working in, whether it's ZBrush or anything. It's a great little app. Highly recommend it. Anyways, back to ZBrush. I've been masking out the main part of the head and then just pulling out and refining the eye shape to kind of match my reference imagery. This, again, masking brushes and that kind of stuff you can do in both the ZBrush and ZBrush Core. But you can see over on the right side of my screen how many brush presets I have available. There's a lot of them. So I'm just zooming in here on the face to get a better idea of the different parts of the face. And then I usually just block them out with simple lines to make sure I have everything sort of organized where it needs to be before I start refining it. So just jumping ahead a little bit, you can see I'm still just working out where all these parts are supposed to be. So I got a couple little holes here for where the antennae are going to go. And again, I'm creating this trio of simple eyes known as the ocelli. So they're like a very primitive eye that is in addition to the compound eyes that you see on either side of the mantis head. So let's talk about mouth parts in ZBrush Core. So if you ever taken a close look at praying mantis or watched a video of them eating, you know that their mouth parts, they have these little appendages that come out that are called the palps. And they come out from underneath the mouth, and they're like little fingers. I guess that's why some people find insects creepy. I find them really cool. And so I'm using Z-spheres to create these. So this workflow I'm using in ZBrush Core. You can do this in ZBrush Core and in ZBrush. These Z-spheres are like a little armature, and they're great for doing creatures and characters and that kind of stuff. As you can see, they almost work perfectly, these little finger-like things. So I'm just adjusting the position of the Z-spheres and adding some more. And what I'm going to do with this armature is I'm going to turn the armature into sculptable geometry once I've blocked out the basic position and scale and all that kind of stuff. So here's just the Z-sphere, and now what I'm doing is I'm converting it to geometry, and there's lots of options in ZBrush Core for the type of geometry or topology you want to create using the Z-spheres. So now that they've been turned into geometry, I'm starting to use the sculpting brushes to add some detail on the divisions between the various parts of the appendages. Okay, so now let's switch over to ZBrush and make some mouth parts here. Now you can use that same Z-sphere workflow that I just demonstrated in ZBrush Core. You can do all of that here in ZBrush, but I'm going to choose a different route just to show one of the big differences between ZBrush Core and ZBrush. So in ZBrush, you have what's known as the Z-Modeler brush. Z-Modeler brush is actually a suite of polygon editing tools. So I've been a Maya modeler for many, many years. So I've done a lot of polygon modeling in programs like Maya or Modo or similar to Blender and that kind of thing. And it's nice to know that in ZBrush, you can actually do that style of modeling because you can manipulate the points and add edge loops and do all kinds of crazy extrusions. And with a fair amount of accuracy, once you get the hang of it, it can start to get really fast. Because you can see I'm not constantly switching over to menus to change various tools. Because ZBrush understands if I'm hovering over a vertex, to use a vertex tool. If I'm hovering over a face, use a face tool. If I'm hovering over an edge, use an edge tool. And then I can use a menu, interactive menu, to switch between the various tools, depending on what I want to do to those components of the polygon mesh. So I'm just rechecking my reference here so you know I'm not making this stuff up. These things really are this weird. And now I'm just kind of using Z-Modeler in point editing mode to kind of just move these things around. You can see I'm selecting some faces and using Q-Mesh, which is a very fancy type of extrusion, to kind of add some geometry where I need it. So once I had the basic shape worked out, I'm going to subdivide it, and I'm going to switch back to our custom blue material here. And then use the gizmo to kind of just position this and tuck it under the mouth. And just use the sculpting brushes to, inflate and move and reposition and shape. The nice thing about this is I've had total control over the topology and how the base mesh is subdivided. That's a nice feature to find in ZBrush. So I know these mouth parts are going to be very, very small on the final ring, but I like to model them out anyways, just because I like to start with at least a kind of a semi-accurate model of the organism that I want to sculpt. So back in ZBrush Core, I'm going to add a polymesh star and convert it into a cube, set my divisions, and switch back to the gizmo and kind of squish it around here. So I'm going to start making the front leg, which is going to be made up of 4 major parts. So here's our reference in Pure Ref. You can see I've got 4 major parts to the front leg. But I'm going to start with a cube and kind of rotate it into place and position it. And I'm going to use this to shape out the femur, which is one of the bigger parts of the leg. And so I've subdivided it, and I'm using the move brush to start to kind of shape it and get the basic position. But I'm not going to bend it so it conforms to the ring just yet. I'm going to model it as if it was straight. And so I've just hidden all the other subtools so I could just focus on this one part. And I'm using a brush. I'm just kind of tweaking the brush settings here to kind of find a nice, turning on lazy mouse so I can make a nice sort of straight but organic line here on both the back and the front. And these are kind of like these ridges that you frequently see sort of as on insect parts. You have these nicely defined borders. They're very organic, but they add a lot of personality to the look of the appendages. So now I'm just using a clay brush to kind of dig in here, to dig in these grooves, and also to smooth out and fill in some of these areas on the top of the femur. Okay, so how would I go about doing the same thing in ZBrush? Well, I've appended a polymesh star. I'm going to convert it into a cube and use my options to set the basic subdivisions. So that's the same thing I just did in ZBrush Core. That's not any different. And again, this is just one of many approaches. I'm using the gizmo to kind of scale it, and I'm going to use the Z-Modeler brush to add a subdivision right there, or add an edge loop. So that's something you can only do in ZBrush. Now what I'm doing is this little trick where you use the gizmo. If you hold the control key and move your geometry with the gizmo, it does this little trick where it duplicates the geometry and masks the original objects. So I just did that twice to create this sort of N shape. So I'm going to do a little bit of repositioning while the other parts are masked, and then clear the mask. And I'm going to use the auto groups feature to make each part of the mesh its own polygroup. That's indicated by the color there. So now I want to kind of show off a new feature in 2021.7. That's the home stage and target stage, or the stager option. And what this allows me to do is I have my parts to my leg here at the center. So I'm going to set that as my home stage. And now I'm going to move it over here to the side, scale it, rotate it, kind of put it roughly in the position I want it to be for when it's in the arm. And I'm going to use that as my target stage. So now I can switch between those two positions at any time while I'm working on the model. So I can flip back and forth between the home stage, where I can use like symmetry and stuff, and also the position where I want to put that part of the leg. So that's really cool. All right, so I've isolated the visibility of this one leg section, and I'm using ZModeler. I'm setting my move options to move with infinite depth, which is going to make it easier to move the points of this model. And infinite depth is based on the viewing angle. So as I'm looking straight on, I know it's moving both the vertex on my side and the vertex on the far side. So it just makes modeling easier. Okay, so I'm using ZModeler to select these faces here, and I'm going to extrude them out using the Q mesh feature. So I know there's a lot of strange terminology with ZBrush. It takes a while to get used to. But yeah, it's just some fancy terminology to basically describe poly modeling tools. Once I get to a point where they're in pretty good shape, I've regrouped them with the auto groups feature, and using the gizmo to kind of just play with the scale and the position a little bit more. But hopefully you're starting to see the various parts and how they're working together. And now I'm actually moving these individual parts. So the advantage of using polygroups, in other words, these different colored groups, is that I can easily use the gizmo to instantly select one and mask the others. So that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm control clicking on the surface while the gizmo is active. That masks the other part, and now I can move this one part around. And so I'm just flipping between masks and that kind of stuff. I usually tell students that, you know, the key to mastering ZBrush is mastering masks and polygroups. I cannot overstate how important understanding those concepts are. So this part of the workflow is very similar to what I was doing in ZBrush Core. I've subdivided the mesh. I still have the polygroups, so I'm going to use the polygroups to hide the other part so I can mask everything but this one part. And now I'm just kind of using the move brush and the sculpting brushes to kind of make more of an organic shape and a little bit more faithful to my reference. So you can see the reference on the side there. The reference image, the legs are folded up a little bit more, but you can kind of see that the basic shape is kind of like an N. And then I'm going to leave the last bit, the tarsi, for a little bit later. So just like I did in ZBrush Core, I'm using the sculpting brushes to kind of define these ridges. So back in ZBrush Core, taking this part of the leg here, and I'm going to use the gizmo to move it. It's kind of looking like a penguin right now. I'm also going to duplicate this so that it's mirrored on the other side, so it can start to work symmetrically. And to do that, I use the mirror and weld features. Now you can see I have that leg part on either side of the ring. So now I'm going to use the move brushes, and I've activated symmetry on the x-axis, so I can use the move brushes to kind of start shaping these things. Now, ZBrush Core, I'm using a very different workflow to create the other parts of the leg. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm using Z-Remesher to rebuild the topology so I can have fewer polygons in a topology that is a little bit easier to work with, lower res model. But I've duplicated that one piece, and now I'm smoothing it. And this is going to be the next section of the leg, sort of like the middle of the N. And I'm going to use the gizmo to kind of position it. So this is kind of a different approach than what I did in ZBrush. And now my ZBrush ring is a little bit ahead of my ZBrush Core ring for anyone who's keeping scores. But that's fine, as long as you can kind of see the similarities and the differences. But I'm starting to shape this leg part, and of course always bring it over to reference to make sure I got something right. But I'm making the basic part of that terrifying blade-like object. And at the moment, I'm not going to worry about the spikes. I'm just focusing on the basic shape, and you can see I'm kind of bending it down to conform to the ring. The ring itself, that geometry is just as a placeholder, so I can keep in the shape and the scale in mind while I work. So I'll be editing that later on to make it more like an actual wearable ring. But right now it's just standard geometry. But I'm using the sculpting brushes to kind of define the shape here and get some of those ridges in there. Doesn't have to be super detailed, but I want to suggest, the thing I like about this insect is the parts of it are very sculptural. It's a very beautiful looking parts to it. So now I need to create the tarsi, which is the segments at the very end of the leg. So I duplicated the tibia. So these are the segments I'm making right here in my reference. So I duplicated the tibia and I just moved it down with the gizmo, and I'm using the sculpting brushes to kind of delineate the various segments here. So I'm using the Damien standard brush as well as the inflate brush to make these segments. So here in ZBrush, I've spent a bit more time refining the surfaces using the custom TW Clay Tubes brush, which is a brush that Thomas Wittelsbach has designed, and it's really nice for refining forms. But I'm just kind of shaping this here, and I'm going to create this little divot at the tibia, and this is the connection point for the tarsi, which are these leg segments right here that you can see in the reference. So that's the tarsi. And you can see how it kind of comes out here in this weird little joint. Really bizarre, but that's what makes it cool. So I'm going to store this current state in history. So I control clicked on that orange marker on the undo history slider. So this is something that's unique to ZBrush and is not available in ZBrush Core. But since I have that history state stored, I can work with the topology. So I'm going to delete my higher levels of subdivision so that I can use an insert mesh brush to add a cube. So this is just another way to add geometry. There's always a dozen ways to do things in ZBrush. This is just another option. So I used insert mesh to add a cube, and now I'm going to delete those edge loops using the Z modeler brush and scale this down and fit roughly where that divot is, or where I think that divot is. I lost all the detail in my higher subdivision levels, but I'm going to bring it back by using that stored history state. So you can see that gray marker on the undo slider. That's where that state is stored in history. And I can use the project history button. So what I'll do is I'll subdivide this mesh. I'll clear the mask now that I've added my geometry, subdivide it, and then project history to get that detail back. And I'll mask off that added geometry so it doesn't get projected as well. So that's a really nice feature. And it just builds in more flexibility into ZBrush. So you can see my detail is now back on those upper parts of the leg. So back to ZBrush Core, let's add some spikes. I'm going to turn on Sculptress mode, which allows me to interactively add tessellation just where I use the brushes. So this is the Sculptress mode option, and it's really cool. It adds a lot of flexibility to ZBrush, and you can see I can control exactly how dense those areas are based on the brush properties. So that's how I'm going to make these little spikies coming out. And of course I need to use the move brush to kind of reposition them. So you can see I have the other subtools set to transparency so I can see through them, which is going to be helpful as I kind of position these little spikes. So back in ZBrush, I'm using the snake hook brush. It's actually the same brush I was using to pull out the spikes in ZBrush Core. So same brush, and I'm using it to pull out these spikes, and I'm just being sort of careful about where I put them. So you see I keep adding them and then undoing it and redoing it, but that's because I'm just sorting it out. So I got these big spikes, and then in between them I got little spikes. Brought back the visibility of the other parts, and I've masked off that middle part so I could just use the move brush to do some refinement. And then I'm just checking out my reference to check out the terrifying spikes on the death blade tibia here. And so I like to have that on the screen next to me. Again, pure rough is great for having reference right there while you're working. And so I'm just going through here and using the snake hook brush to pull these spikes out. Okay, so once I have enough spikes, I'm using the bend arc deformer as a way to bend, get a nice accurate bend in all the leg parts at once, and then I'm using the gizmo to move it. So the bend arc deformer is actually built into the gizmo. And there's a bunch of deformers available when you click on a little gear icon in the gizmo menu. There's a whole bunch of deformers available. There are deformers available also in ZBrush Core using the same menu, but there's more deformers available in ZBrush than there are in ZBrush Core. So that's another difference to keep in mind. The deformers are very useful. I like them. I love them for situations like this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mirror over this leg over to the other side. So I used mirror and weld to do this, but of course I deleted my lower levels of subdivision in order to do that. So one of the features that ZBrush has that ZBrush Core doesn't have is you can rebuild your subdivisions. So the fact that I deleted all my lower levels of subdivision, I can use the rebuild function to bring those subdivision back. And it's just another, adds more flexibility to your overall workflow. And that's another difference between ZBrush, ZBrush Core. Don't have the rebuild function in ZBrush Core. So back in ZBrush Core, I'm going to create the antenna. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create just on one side, then duplicate it. And I'm going to use Z-spheres again. So I've taken the Z-sphere and I've moved it down. I'm going to stick it here in this little ditch that I carved in the top of the head on the mantis. So you can see I'm having it poke out of there. And my solution for the antenna, because I can't have them coming straight out of the head, because those would be, you know, part of a big spike coming out of a ring is not usually a good idea, especially when it's kind of like a hypodermic needle. So instead, I'm going to use the Z-spheres to kind of push these down here and have it conform to the outside of the ring, which should allow me to create kind of this nice beaded pattern, because the antennae have a lot of segments. So I've converted it to geometry, duplicated it using mirror and weld. So I have antenna on both sides of the head, turned on X symmetry, and now I'm using the inflate brush to kind of create the segments for the antenna. In this case, you know, these are going to be stylized, so it's going to look kind of like this little beaded surface. In ZBrush, I'm using a different approach, but the result will be similar. So I'm using, I used a polygon ring, and now I'm using ZModeler to kind of symmetrically pull this geometry out, and I'm just going to have it kind of arch over and then stick in to those little holes on the top of the head, kind of like little pipes. So it's kind of like plumbing, I guess, in a weird way. So just kind of rearranging the vertices, and then I'll do one last extrusion. You can see they're stuck in the head. Now I'm going to subdivide that geometry and use the inflate brush to create segments similar to what I did before. And I'm just kind of playing around with different settings in the inflate brush to see what's going to work best for creating this kind of like beaded pattern. Back in ZBrush Core, it's time to worry about the ring itself. So I've used polygroups on the ring geometry so that I can mask just that central band on the outside of the ring. And then I'm going to use the noise plugin to add some procedural noise. And so I can just play with the noise a little bit and bake it into the surface. Then I'm going to fuse all of these parts together, legs, head, ring, and everything, and dynamesh the surface. So what dynamesh does is it creates a single mesh and fuses all the different parts together. And now that I've done that, I'm going to use the insert mesh brush as a way to add little blobs of digital clay so that it can help make printing a bit easier, so I don't have so many undercuts and weird little surfaces and that kind of stuff. So I'm just adding these little blobs of digital clay and then re-dynameshing. I know that's a weird term, but dynamesh just basically means it fuses everything into one surface. So back in ZBrush, I've decided I want to add some detail to the eyes here, so it's more obvious that these are the compound eyes that we associate with insects. And these are a bit big for a mantis, obviously, but it's going to be on a ring, so these are going to be very, very small in detail. So I'm just using an inflate brush with the drag dot option to kind of just sketch these on here into this sort of pattern fairly quickly. Let's fast forward a little bit, because that's repetitive, and I'm finished here, and I'm going to use this new adjust last feature in combination with undo history as a way to kind of fine-tune the strength of those strokes. Even though I made, you know, a few hundred strokes there, since I stored a history state, I can use this adjust last as a way to kind of play with the strength. And you can see that's really useful when I look at the ring from far away at a more realistic scale. I still want to be able to see that detail, so that adjust last is really cool. Now I'm adding those I'm just digging into the surface here to add the pseudo pupil, which is those dark spots that you see on the eyes of mantis. And as you can see, I mean, they're not real pupils, they're an optical illusion, but I'm just kind of trying to figure out exactly where to put them. But they add so much personality, and I think this is like one of the best features of the ring, because you kind of zero in on those eyes and it looks like it has kind of an expression it's looking at you. So I thought that was fun to put those in there. So I'm jumping ahead in time here in the ZBrush version. So I'm in ZBrush and I'm getting ready to fuse all these parts together using Dynamesh, just like I did in ZBrush Core. So now they're fused together, and that way when I control, drag, and release, you can see it rebuilds the surface, and those little gaps are filled. As I use the inflate brush and the smooth brush, I can seal them up a little bit better and then re-Dynamesh the surface, so that it recalculates and refuses it, and I can keep refining the geometry that way. That's something you can also do in ZBrush Core. You have more options for Dynamesh when you're using ZBrush, but you can still use the same basic technique in ZBrush Core. So that's kind of handy. And I'm going to use the exact same method I used in ZBrush Core to add little blobs of digital clay so that I can fuse up some of those little gaps and those overhangs. But you can see I'm adding a little bit of clay there, and I'm going to inflate it and then use Dynamesh to fuse those parts together and then smooth and refine. And this will make it one, the goal here is to make it one continuous surface that's going to be watertight so that I can actually print it. All right, one last time over in ZBrush Core, we're ready to prepare this for export so we can print it. So I'll go to 3D Print Hub plugin, check the size ratios, make sure it's the right size, check the mesh volume, make sure it's closed and there's no holes in it. Everything looks good so far. I'm going to rename this duplicate of the subtool, and I'm going to decimate it, which is going to triangulate the surface and preserve the detail, bringing the polygon count down to a point like 250,000, which should be good for printing software. Double check to make sure it's a closed volume. It still is. Double check the size ratios. Everything is good. And now I can export from ZBrush Core as an STL, and I'm ready to send it to my printing software. I'll probably add some more details, like I like the eye facets on the ZBrush version, so I might do that for the ZBrush Core version, but I can use the same techniques to do that. But overall, a good demonstration of how you can make a ring in ZBrush Core. And now finally, back to ZBrush and doing a little bit of refinement, kind of a similar process. I'm going to use Kitco metal quotes just to make sure that the surface is closed. I'm going to check the size ratios, make sure it's the right size. I usually do that a couple times, and I'm going to export as an STL from ZBrush and send it off to my printing software. So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this little battle between ZBrush Core and ZBrush. You can see I added a little bit more detail to the eyes in the ZBrush Core version using pretty much the same techniques, the inflate brush and that kind of thing. Regardless, I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration and you get a sense of the differences between Core and ZBrush. It's kind of like the difference between a 25-foot sailboat and a luxury yacht. They'll both take you to the same place, but the yacht will probably get you there faster, and at that point the analogy kind of breaks down. If you're just starting out and you're testing the waters, you want to dip your toe into ZBrush, my recommendation is try out ZBrush Core first, because you can rent it. You can rent a license for like $10 a month from Pixelogic. It's very inexpensive. You can play around with it, see how much you like it, and if you decide that this is something that you want to incorporate into your jewelry or your object fabrication pipeline, at a certain point you'll probably want to make the leap over into the main ZBrush because it has so many powerful tools that we just scratched the surface on in this video. Over at ZBJW, this is the kind of thing we do. We teach ZBrush to people who want to use it in jewelry or fabrication. I would like to point out that we will have a much longer, extended, more in-depth video series on the ZBrush version of this ring coming out shortly for ZBJW members. As always, click like and subscribe to see more videos from ZBJW. So we'll see you in the future.